Okay, boys and girls, here is chapter 64. He surely will. Keeping to the moon-cast shadows beneath the palms, Peter trotted along the beach toward the longboat. As he drew closer, he heard angry shouts and a cracking sound, as well as other stranger noises, and saw figures in and around the boat in frenzied activity, apparently fighting. Who would the pirates be fighting? He stopped and looked back toward the rocky point. There was still no sign of or Molly. It's taking them forever. Peter hesitated. On the one hand, he was reluctant to get too close to the battle ahead and risk capture. On the other hand, he was very curious to know who was fighting the pirates and where the trunk was. He decided he could risk getting a little closer. He had walked no more than 20 feet when he heard it, a moan coming from his right at the water's edge. He stopped and heard it again, louder this time. He glanced ahead at the shouting figures, then, keeping his head low, darted down the beach to the water. He saw her immediately, a girl lying face down in the shallow water, her long blonde hair splayed forward, touching the sand. She appeared to be struggling to crawl onto the beach. Her arms moved feebly, her hands clawing at the wet sand. Peter ran to the girl, dropping to his knees into the water. He took her by the shoulders and turned her over, and immediately noticed several things. The first was that she was startlingly beautiful with astonishingly large, luminescent green eyes. The second was that she did not appear to be wearing any clothes, her only covering coming from her lush cascade of hair. Ordinarily, this second thing would have gotten Peter's full attention, but he was much distracted by the third thing, which was blood seeping from a deep gash in her forehead. Supporting the girl's head in his hands, Peter looked frantically around for something to put over the wound. My shirt, he thought. He decided to pull the girl farther up on the sand so he could rest her head on the beach while he removed his shirt. Getting his hand under her arms, he heaved backward. That was when Peter noticed the fourth, even more startling thing. She had a tail. Ah, said Peter, jumping up, dropping her head. The girl, or fish, or whatever she was, moaned piteously and writhed in pain. Peter stood over her, water dripping from his body. Who are you? He said. The mermaid did not answer, but blinked and looked at Peter as if seeing him for the first time. Those eyes! She drew a sharp breath, her expression suddenly fearful. It's okay, said Peter, softly, kneeling again. I won't hurt you. The mermaid's expression remained wary, but her large green eyes closed again. Peter saw she was weakening rapidly as her blood, dark in the moonlight, continued to ooze onto the sand. I'm going to put a bandage on you, said Peter, untucking his shirt. You'll be fine. But she didn't seem to hear him. Her head had slumped sideways now, and the life seemed to be slowly draining from her face. Peter felt certain it was too late for a bandage to do much good, but, not knowing what else to do, he began to pull his shirt over his head, only to get it tangled in the locket. Peter slipped it off his neck and looked at it. He'd meant to give it back to Molly, but then had appeared, and in the excitement he'd forgotten. He had no idea how much, if any, star stuff was left in it. If there was any, it likely wasn't much. Should I save it? I might need it against the pirates. Molly might need it. The mermaid moaned again, a weak sound, a dying sound. Peter looked at her face, then at the locket, then down the still empty beach toward the rocky point. I'm sorry, Molly, he whispered the apology and then snapped open the locket. Immediately a sphere of golden light blinded him, first his hands, then the rest of his body, experienced the now familiar warmth and feeling of well-being. Peter wanted to luxuriate in that feeling, but forced himself to invert the locket and pour its contents onto the mermaid's wounded forehead. The warmth quickly drained out of him. The glow spread over the girl's body, then disappeared, like water absorbed by a sponge. It's working. In a moment, the glow was gone. Peter picked up the locket. It still hung open, but was now just lifeless metal. He snapped it shut and put it back around his neck. He found himself aware of the silence. The splashing and shouting from down the beach had stopped. He started to rise to have a look when he felt a hand grip his forearm. Startled, he whirled and saw that the mermaid was sitting up, her eyes open and focused on Peter. Her wound was gone. Are you all right? Peter asked. The girl said nothing, but reached her hand out and gently traced her fingers along the side of Peter's face. He blushed. She smiled, a stunningly beautiful smile. As they stared at each other, Peter heard a splash a few yards offshore and, looking up, saw not one, but two, no, three more mermaids. Waist high in the shallow water, they hissed at him and dragged themselves forward. Peter tried to scramble away, but the blonde mermaid made an odd, deep-throated sound, and they stopped their advance. An exchange of strange sounds followed. The three other mermaids smiled at Peter, who blushed even more. This pleasant scene was interrupted by the sudden surfacing of yet another mermaid who, with barely a glance at Peter, emitted a rapid series of throaty sounds that clearly excited and alarmed the other three. They whirled around, and with a flash of their green tails, they were gone under water. The mermaid who Peter had rescued hesitated only a moment longer, giving Peter's arm one final squeeze. She offered another radiant smile, slid gracefully into the water, and then she was gone too. Seconds later, the whole group of mermaids surfaced 20 yards to Peter's left, making sounds, gesticulating excitedly to one another. Peter stood on his tiptoes, but couldn't see. He ran up the beach and looked back. The mermaids were trying to work their way through the shallows to a dark form lying wave-lapped at the water's edge. Peter blinked, not believing his luck. The trunk, unguarded. Racing through the shallow water, he reached it in seconds. There was no question, even in the brilliant moonlight, he could see the glow through the cracks. The moment his hand touched the rough wood, he felt the familiar warmth. His attention was drawn away by urgent sounds out in the lagoon. The mermaids, struggling frantically to make their way to him, were waving their arms and flopping their now useless tails through the shallow water. The blonde mermaid he'd saved was in front. Her eyes met his as she made a series of urgent but incomprehensible sounds, clearly trying to tell him something. "What is it?" Peter said. "What, A club-like wooden handle of Little Richard's whip, 2 feet of 2-inch diameter oak, slammed in Peter's skull from behind. Peter instantly crumpled to the shallow water, unable to break his fall, and lay face down, motionless. The mermaids, hissing, lunged forward with teeth bared, but were at a hopeless disadvantage in the shallow water and scurried back as the whip cracked at them. "Forget them," said Sling. They can't reach us here. Get the trunk. We're going back to the longboat." "But if we're in the boat, those things will swamp us again," said little Richard, gesturing at mermaids. "Not this time," said Sling. "With what's in the trunk, we can leave the way we came in, flying over them she-devils." He laughed at the mermaids, who were highly agitated. He noticed that one of them, the blonde one, was, despite the risk of the whip, crawling toward Peter, who had not moved. "Oh, you fancy this, lad, don't you?" he asked. "You're welcome to him." With his right foot, he gave Peter's motionless form, still face down, a shove toward the deeper water. "Get the trunk," said Sling to little Richard, "and let's get off this miserable island." Little Richard hoisted the trunk to his shoulder, then glanced down at Peter. "Shouldn't we turn the boy over?" he called to Sling. "If we leave him like that, he'll surely drown." "Oh, yes," said Sling, not looking back. "He surely will."